started.
Okay, it's all up to you now. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Just a few announcements real quick. Gray whales are here in San Diego, and I encourage you all to get out there on the water and go out with any one of our many whale watching operators. The next presentation is going to be March 9th with David McGuire of Shark Stewards, and he's going to talk about the sharks that hang out in the California area and why they're important to us. If you would like more information about that or to become a member or renew your membership, go to our website at acssandiego.org. If you have questions for tonight's speaker, or I'm sorry, if you have speaker recommendations or any questions for us, please email us at acssandiego10@gmail.com. And then during tonight's presentation, if you have any questions, ask them through the chat room, and we'll respond to those questions at the end. And so to start off this evening, we have Sabena Saddiqui. Sabena was born in India and raised in Indiana. She has a passion for whale communication, and this has taken her to some incredible locations such as Egypt, the Bahamas, the North Atlantic, and Hawaii. She began studying humpback whale calls in Woods Hole and obtained a master's degree in Hawaii. She's currently a PhD student at Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute. She's also an ACS National Board member and has served as the student chair for 10 years and represents the International Whaling Commission for ACS. To promote gender equality and diversity in science, she served as the lead editor of the first publication highlighting women cetacean scientists through the ACS Whale Watcher special issue, which you get as a member of ACS. And the title of that issue was Breaking the Surface, Women of Cetology. So without further ado, I introduce you to Sabena Saddiqui.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share screen now. Okay, I'm going to assume it's working. You guys just let me know. Let me move this out of the way. All right. So yeah, today I'm going to talk to you about humpback whale non-song calls in the Hawaiian breeding ground. And this is the work I did for my master's. So first, we're just going to introduce the humpback whale, which I think many of you are familiar with. And we just talked about how cool they are a few minutes ago. So they are in the baleen whale family. They're found in every ocean in the world. There's 14 distinct populations. And some of the populations were reduced by 95% from global whaling before the international ban on whaling was implemented in 1986. Humpback whales make large annual migrations of over 25,000 kilometers from tropical breeding grounds to their colder feeding grounds. Some of the threats that humpback whale populations are facing are vessel strikes, entanglement in fishing gear, climate change, noise pollution, among others. So the Hawaiian breeding ground is a very important region for the North Pacific population of humpback whales. Each winter, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 humpback whales come to what I call vacation, but it's for breeding and birthing calves in Hawaii for their breeding season. And this infographic here kind of shows how the populations migrate between the two regions. So Hawaii is shown here as the winter breeding area, and these are summer feeding areas. And as far as we know, a lot of the whales go between the Alaskan feeding ground and the Hawaiian breeding ground, but some of them also go to other areas. And it's important to talk about the region where the study was done. So Hawaii is an island chain in the Pacific Ocean. It's considered the most isolated population center in the world. The Hawaiian Kingdom is an indigenous island chain that was once independent until it was overthrown by the United States. And it's comprised of 8 main islands that are populated by people. The geography includes active and dormant volcanoes, which can be found throughout the island chain. And another thing that's very interesting is what role whales play in the local culture. So in Hawaiian culture, there's a strong connection between people, land, sky, and sea. And they have a very detailed method of observing nature, which is actually very methodical. In their culture, they have something called the amakua, which are ancestors who take the form of an animal or plant. They can appear in dreams and visions and provide spiritual guidance. So in the Hawaiian language, there is a word called kohola, which is a general word for whale. And it's found in the Kumulipu, which is the ancient creation chant. So the reason I'm bringing up language is because they have such a detailed way of describing nature, and that's reflected in the language. Humpback whales are not really detailed in the language. We only know of kohola, which is a general word for whales. So it's possible that perhaps there were more detailed words for humpback whales. Perhaps it was lost when Hawaiian culture has gone through a lot of changes because of colonization. Some scientists believe that humpback whales may have not always historically been present in such large numbers in the Hawaiian Islands. And there was a whaling station in Hawaii just primarily there for and to also slaughter the whales that they had captured. And the records from these whaling stations show real sighting or indication of large numbers of humpback whales. And humpback whales are rumored to be seen sometimes before the 1960s in Hawaii, but they began to dramatically increase in numbers. So this brings up a lot of interesting questions about if Hawaii is a new breeding ground or, for these humpback whales, or did they return after whaling nearly wiped them out? Perhaps they had to adapt and change in response to what whaling did to their population. So today in Hawaii, humpback whales are, in the thousands every winter during the whale season, as we call it. And there's a large ecotourism industry. People travel from all over the world for the famous whale watching during the winter months. And it's an ideal research setting, given that the waters are so clear and warm. So I also want to talk about how sound impacts cetaceans and whales. So as you guys know, the ocean can be pretty dark and murky and have low visibility. So that's the reason why a lot of marine animals, particularly marine mammals, rely on sound. And sound travels further in the water column compared to air, so it's more efficient. So bioacoustics is a study of sounds made by animals or nature, and that's the topic of today's talk. Large whales use sound as a primary sense for many important things like mating, aggression, feeding, navigation. And this image here kind of shows a few things. First, it shows sources of sound in the environment. So you can see these sound waves coming from a whale itself, plus research vessels, other types of ships and vessels. And then it also shows different ways we record these sounds. Here you have these bottom mounted recorders. We have autonomous remote vehicles that can record sounds. We have recorders or hydrophones that are towed from vessels. And then we also have acoustic tags we place on whales. So many of you are familiar with humpback whale song. Today we're talking about non-song calls, but I think it's important to talk about song so we can put it in context why it's important to study all the other sounds they make. So song was discovered in the 1970s by Roger Payne, and it helped inspire the international Save the Whales movement, which led to the global environmental movement. Song is notably complex in its structure and its pattern, and song can last for a long time. It can last for hours. Songs are also produced by males only and mostly heard on the breeding grounds, although we do pick up humpback whales' song when they're migrating and sometimes on their feeding ground. But song is occurring a lot more on the breeding ground. Song is very dynamic. It changes within a winter season and then also changes between the seasons, which indicates a cultural transmission occurring in these whale populations for passing along that song information. There are many possible functions for song. It's been heavily studied since the 70s, but even then, we're not entirely sure on its exact function. Likely, it probably serves multiple functions. So could be displays for mating, It's been proposed to be there for synchronizing estrus in females, even male cooperation. And it's even been proposed and thought of as a potential use for sonar. But song is only one portion of the humpback whale communication system. And that brings us to today's topic, which is non-song calls. Unlike song, non-song calls, and in papers, they're also referred to as social sounds. For the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to call them calls. These calls are produced by both males and females, and these calls can be heard in all the regions that humpback whales hang out, including their migratory grounds, feeding, and breeding grounds. Calls lack the rhythmic or pattern quality that we see in songs, and they're historically understudied, but studies are gaining traction in this topic. We now have a few studies about feeding grounds, particularly the Alaskan feeding ground, migratory routes off of Eastern and Western Australia, and breeding grounds, which is what this study is looking at. Non-song sounds also include percussive sounds, such as the sounds they make when they're breaching or using their fins to slap the surface. But today we're just going to focus on the vocalizations. So here I have an example of song. So let me know if you cannot hear the audio. Now we have non-song calls. They're more random, there's not a notable pattern, and there are often periods of silence between the calls. Okay, so why is it important to study these non-song calls? First off, it will help us to understand the impact of man-made noise on communication. And we as humans pollute the ocean with sound through various methods, such as oil drilling, shipping, cruises, and even recreational vessel traffic and military exercises. Detailing their calls can also help us with long-term monitoring. So by listening in on whale calls, this will help us know where they are and when, so we can put protections in place to limit noise pollution. We can also compare the calls from this population with different populations to see what role evolution or their environment may play in what sounds they make and the development of the communication system. For example, if whales are making different calls when they're in Alaska on their feeding grounds versus when they're in Hawaii in their breeding grounds, what could be the reason for that? That can point us to possible functions for specific calls, and it could also lead to maybe the environment or the habitat plays a role. And many of the same whales migrate between these two regions, if you guys remember from that infographic showing the migration route between Hawaii and Alaska. So that's why it'd be really interesting to see how it compares to the studies that are already out there about the Alaskan feeding ground. So this study that I'm going to be talking about today used a 10-year archival database of underwater video and acoustic recordings. And the first goal was to establish a call repertoire. What that basically means is like a catalog of call types. We want to know what calls are they making. And this is done through acoustic analysis of the calls, as well as a statistical analysis called a cluster analysis. So I wanted to know how often they're producing these calls, or the call rate, as well as what types of calls they're making. And then I also wanted to find out, how does that relate to their social grouping, their pod type and the pod composition? Who are the whales that are making these calls and what groups are they in? And then also what behaviors are occurring, because I had the benefit of having underwater video, so I could actually kind of see what they're doing below the surface. So a spectrogram is a visual representation of sound. And we're going to zero in on one call here. So this is the call, and this is the start frequency and the end frequency. And this is the fundamental frequency, which is what we mostly focus on when we're measuring acoustic parameters in these kinds of studies. These lines you see up here are harmonics, which are not as important for this kind of study. And time is the x-axis and kilohertz are the y-axis. So this is kind of how long the duration of the call is and where it is in terms of pitch. And I use a program called Raven Pro software to bring up this call. So now we're going to get into the social grouping on breeding grounds. There are various types of humpback whale pods you can find on a breeding ground like in Hawaii, including dyads, which are a pair of whales, mother and calf pods, a mother and calf and an escort, competitive pods, and singer pods. And I'm going to detail a bit of each of those. So mother and calf pods, I have a video here which will give you an idea of what the data looks like that I was working with. Humpback whale calves are very dependent on their mothers for nourishment, protection, and their development, and they're often seen closely following the mother. So here's a video to kind of give you an example of what I saw in the data set. Oops. And then we have mother calf escort pods. And these are mother calf pairs that are accompanied by a single male escort. We're not entirely sure what the purpose is of, or the goal is of the male escort, but we think they may be engaging in mate guarding. Perhaps they've recently mated with this female and they want to guard her from mating with any other males to ensure that they become the father. I kind of like to think of them as like temporary boyfriends for a few hours that kind of hang out with the mom and calf. It's a video example. I apologize, the video seems to be a little slow, so not as smooth. Dyads are, as I mentioned, pairs of whales. They spend a large portion of time stationary in deeper water. And in the field, we refer to them as breath holders. So they can be a little boring, but they're still important. On the breeding ground, it's usually two males or a male and a female. It's very rare to see two females together. As you can see, they're chilling and relaxing. Just a reminder to make sure your feeds are muted.
Yeah, Yuli, there's somebody. Yuli, can you not mute? I mean, mute yourself, please. Thank you.
And now we have competitive pods, which are super interesting and fun. They contain multiple males that are competing for a single female, which are called the nuclear animal. So they're kind of the nuclear center of the pod. And these pods display a lot of high energy behaviors. So this video, you should be able to hear some vocalizations. And this is just another video of competitive pods. Their size can vary from just 3 animals to over 25. the methods in the study, data was collected, like I said, over 10 years from 1998 through 2007 off of Maui, which has some of the highest concentrations of humpback whales in the island chain. And video and acoustic recordings were collected by a diver with a snorkel using a digital video camera and custom underwater housing with an attached hydrophone. And that's what this is. So this is a custom housing. There's a video camera in there, and then the hydrophone's attached. And this guy is Dr. Adam Pack, who's my master's advisor, who helped collect a lot of the data. All recordings were accompanied by detailed surface and underwater observation where researchers and volunteers logged the behaviors and the social grouping. So for the behavioral analysis, I looked at behaviors at the group level. And the reason I did this is because in acoustics research, we do have a unique challenge in that we can't really confirm which whale is producing a call. So it's hard to know, which individual made a call. Unlike birds, for example, or people doing bioacoustics research with terrestrial animals, you can usually see birds kind of opening their mouths, and there's some visual indication that they're producing a call. But cetaceans can be odd in that they don't have any real indication. Sometimes you can see bubbles emerging from the blowhole, but that's pretty rare. So that's why I looked at behavior of the pod in general. So the different behavioral categories were traveling, stationary, and active. The active behaviors include really high energy behaviors, either occurring at the surface or below the surface. And that includes lunges, strikes, rolling, aerial displays such as breaching and slapping of the various spins, pectoral or tail, and also head slapping at the surface. So a lot of the active behaviors were very common. So for the results, we had approximately 52 hours of video recordings that I went through, and that resulted in 7,795 total calls collected. So throughout the study period, this 10-year period, the research team wasn't just focusing on non-song calls, they were filming all kinds of pods. And throughout that study period, only 14% of the pods were actually found to have non-song calls. So throughout the study period, there were 1,500 or so total pods recorded, and of those, just 211 of those pods were found to have non-song calls occurring. So, that kind of leads to assumption that, at least on this breeding ground during this study period, the humpback whales are producing less non-song calls than in other studies, where maybe on the feeding ground where they're producing calls a lot more commonly. And that might be because song is so prevalent on the breeding ground that there might just not be as much use or even space to make these calls, because song can be so loud. And if any of you guys have been to Hawaii, had the luck to be there during the breeding season, you can hear song pretty much everywhere. It fills the ocean. So of the pods that did have non-song calls, the majority of them, 65%, were competitive pods. And the next big group was dyad pods with 15%. And then mother calf with escort pods. And mother calf pairs and single whales were a much smaller portion of the data set. So the cluster analysis, which, if you guys remember, is the statistical analysis I use to kind of quantitatively figure out how to group these calls into call types. These calls are classified into 5 big call groups, and each of those call groups had a few call types within it. So there are 18 total call types, but they were clustered into 5 groups depending on their shared acoustic features. Another thing I'd like to mention is, of those 7,000 or so total calls that I detected, I was only able to use 1,500 of those, or about 20% of those calls, for the statistical analysis. And the reason for that is, in acoustics research, you can get a lot of calls in a data set, but because of background noise or some kind of interference, you can't always use those calls for statistical analysis. So that's something I learned when I started doing acoustics research. Kind of surprised me that you can't use all the data because it's not necessarily high quality enough. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these call groups and play you sound clips. They are a little on the quiet side, so I hope you can hear them. I'll try to play them multiple times. High frequency tonal calls were the most common group in the data set, and a lot of these calls have high frequencies, as you would guess. And here is a shriek. If there's an asterisk by the call name, that means that this call has been discovered in another study and named by another researcher. So I was just going with the naming system. So that's pretty short duration. And then we have squeak. Just very short and high frequency. Literally sounds like a squeak. And then we have low frequency harmonic calls. This is the second most common call group. And I'm going to play you some examples. This whoop call is pretty common in a lot of populations, so it seems to be an important call. And next we have a modulated moan. Descending moan. A yap. And now we have the yelp call. And then a cry call, which is a bit longer. And then we have the low frequency pulsed and grunt calls. Let's see. And these are the shortest duration calls. And since they're low frequency, they may be a little harder to hear. So this is called the grunt. And then the purr. And this low grind call, I was excited to find because I haven't seen it noted in other studies. It's like a very low frequency croaking kind of sound. And if you can't hear anything, I'm happy to try to recreate it myself, but I would really rather not. So we have mid to high frequency harmonic calls. They have a higher frequency compared to the last group. And they have kind of a dynamic structure moving up or down in pitch throughout the duration of the call. So we're going to start with ascending moan. Next, we have variable screech. And I was also excited about this one because I haven't seen it described in another study. And ascending screech. And lastly, the noisy complex calls. This is the least common call group, and they have the longest durations. And first, we're going to start with the long screech, which is also something I haven't seen in other studies. Washboard. Squeegee, which sounds exactly like a squeegee. And washboard cry. It's kind of like that washboard sound we heard in the last slide, but there's like a cry occurring during it. So now I want to talk about how these calls compare to other populations. Of the 18 call types that I found with this population, 12 of those have been found in other studies. So in this image here, I have the 12 calls that I found. And if they showed up in studies of these other populations, so the Southeast Alaskan feeding ground, the Eastern Australian migration route, the Western Australian migration route, Angola, Africa breeding ground, and the North Atlantic feeding ground. So you'll notice that East Australia migration route has calls that were shared a lot with the study. And I think that might be because this region has the most studies, and this is just a sampling, there are more studies on it. So, take this with a grain of salt. As we continue producing more research and papers, we might find that some of these calls are going to appear in other populations. And these aren't all the humpback whale populations. These are just the ones that have non-song call studies. What is interesting though is the whoop call is present in every population. You can see that here. So kind of makes you wonder if it's a species-wide call. So for the Southeast Alaskan feeding ground in Hawaii, 7 calls were shared between the 2 populations. And one thing that's really interesting is that squeegee call is only present in Hawaii and Alaska and has not been noted in any other studies. So it's possible that that could be a unique call to this population of North Pacific humpback whales. But like I said, we need more research to kind of really make definitive conclusions. So in terms of behavior and call type, I found that the active behavior had the most variety of calls, and the traveling behavior had the least number of calls in general. So that kind of indicates that maybe they're not producing vocalizations very much when they're traveling, but they're doing it a lot more when they're doing active behaviors. Just and active behaviors probably have a function that's social. So for pod type and call type, I found that mother calf pods had no high frequency tonal and low frequency harmonic calls, even though those 2 call groups are the most common call types. So it's interesting that mother calf pods had no instances of those specific calls. Mother calf pods also produce low frequency calls similar to those found in other studies of mother calf pods. Single whales were found to produce high frequency tonal and harmonic calls. And that is similar to other studies of other species, including terrestrial species, where there's an isolated animal. They tend to find that they produce high frequency calls. So it's interesting that whales that were alone were producing high frequency calls. Dyad pairs had the most high frequency tonal calls, and competitive pods had all the call types. They're getting really creative in their trash talk maybe, and they just need all the different call types to use to communicate what they're trying to say. So the results with pod size and call rate show us that call rates increased when there were more whales. Basically, bigger pods had more calls. And for pod type and call rate, it was seen that call rate varied depending on the type of pod. Competitive pods stood out as having the highest average call rates, in addition to what I mentioned earlier about them having all the different call types. So they're, talking a lot and in a very elaborate way. Calls likely have a role in mate competition. It can be assumed considering that they seem to be most common in these competitive pods. Now, in terms of calf presence, pods without a calf had higher call rates. So for whatever reason, the presence of a calf impacted the rates of which calls were occurring. So like I said, it is interesting that mother calf pods made up a small portion of these pods that had these non-song calls, and that may be because other research has shown a phenomenon called vocal crypsis, which is where mother calf pods make lower energy calls to possibly avoid nearby competitive males. And this could be to save energy and avoid potential injury to the calf. The mothers maybe just don't want to deal with annoying males. So that might be why the mother calf pods in this study were found to not be vocalizing a whole lot. So just to tie this all together, what is the significance of this study or of these kinds of studies? As I mentioned, tourism and whale watching continues to grow in this critical habitat for this population. And due to the low frequency and the softness of some of these humpback calls, these calls are at a greater risk for being drowned out by noise pollution. And that can lead to a phenomenon called acoustic masking, which is proven to negatively impact whales' ability to communicate with each other. So it's kind of getting drowned out by noise pollution in the habitat. And calls found in several populations could be good candidates for acoustic monitoring. We can determine which calls are species-wide calls, and those are calls that we can look for when we're doing acoustic monitoring of the species that can help with conservation and management. So there are a lot of different factors looked at in the study, and I just want to wrap up the main conclusions, which are the majority of pods in the study did not produce non-song calls. 86% of them did not have those calls on the breeding ground throughout the study period. And the unique calls found here, there were some unique calls found, but there are also shared calls with other populations across the globe in different behavioral contexts. So that's really interesting about the species communication system. And we know that social grouping does impact call rate. We found that competitive pods and large pods without calves produce the most calls. We also found that behavior impacts what kind of calls are produced. We saw that active behaviors were most associated with call production and different call types. And we found that there are some common call types across populations. And that suggests that these calls may be a stable part of the humpback whale communication system. I'd like to acknowledge my master's advisor, Dr. Adam Pack, and the committee members, Dr. Allison Stemper and Patrick Hart, that helped me, as well as the NSF Crest Fellowship that helped fund the study. And the data were all collected under the appropriate federal and local permits, and it was collected over 10 years via a team of scientists and volunteers, including the Dolphin Institute, Kewalo Basin Marine Mammal Lab, University of Hawaii Earthwatch program. So it's a huge team effort, and a lot of people put in a lot of hard work to get this data. So I'd just like to acknowledge and appreciate that. And thank you so much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Sabena. That was really, really good, interesting, and congratulations on your master's and good luck on your doctorate. We encourage people to put questions into the chat, and I will read them to Sabena if you have questions. And so we do have one. Can females produce song as well? And if so, why do you think they do not make them? So I think it's more of a physical thing. Can they make sound? And then why don't they basically use that? I think is kind of how I'd interpret that.
Okay, well, since females do make non-song calls, I'm sure that I would think that they would have the capacity to produce song, because song is really just a more elaborate patterned, longer duration series of calls. But as far as we know, we haven't found an instance of a female being a singer. And when we're in the field, we can do, collect biopsy samples and as one way to confirm gender or sex. And another way to do that is, for example, the team I've worked with, like Adam Pack, if he was the one who was collecting the data as a snorkeler, sometimes he would be able to dive down and see the genital region to confirm that. So we just haven't found instances of females producing song, but it could be possible, I guess. But up until now, that has not been ever evidenced.
Okay. And do you have any idea at what age a calf might begin to make calls that would go beyond communicating with their mother?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to really be right there with them all the time. So it's, research wise, it's almost an impossible thing to do, but I thought I would ask that. Yeah,
that would be tricky, but there aren't a whole lot of mother calf communication studies, but I know in the last few years there have been several out of a research group. I think can't remember if it's Eastern or Western Australia. So that was one of the papers that discovered Volpocrypsis, and I know Anne Zuidas did a study of Hawaii looking at calf calls, but none of those, as far as I can tell, were able to really determine calf age. So we don't know exactly when they start vocalizing the calves, and when, I guess if you could see them vocalizing once they've separated from the mother, that would be one way to tell. But that's a good question.
So this might be a really hard research question as well, but how do whales react when they first meet one another for the very first time?
Oh, I don't think we know if they've just met, but that would be really cool to see.
And then
be able to confirm.
Okay, and that's just a tough one. I wanted to ask that to you. Uko is asking, is there any overlap in call type in both breeding grounds and feeding grounds? And I guess that was what you are rapidly studying. So
yeah, there were some call types shared in the Southeast Alaskan feeding ground studies, and this one, I think it was 6 of them, and then there was one that was just unique to Alaska and Hawaii. So that was the one, the squeegee call, but I was wondering if that is specific to this population. Some of the other shared call types were also found in other populations.
Okay, and then I'm going to slip one of mine in. When you played the squeak, it has kind of a rising frequency. It kind of gets more shrill, but there was kind of an underlying bass to it. Is that background noise, or is that animal making that rising sound at the same time of uttering the bass?
Oh, that's wow! You're like an acoustician that you notice that.
I'll have to be on your advisory team.
You should. That's a really good question, because background noise is always there. But humpback whales are capable of a phenomenon called biphonization, where they can emit multiple frequencies simultaneously. So it could have been like a low frequency bass occurring too.
Yeah, it just was hard to tell whether it was background. It seemed different than background noise to me, and then I thought, gosh, if that whale is vocalizing both the bass and the shrill at the same time, that'd be interesting anatomy to understand how they do that. Rin is asking, when studying the calls for your research, do you have to distinguish and parse whale calls that happen at the same time, or do the whales usually only talk one at a time? Just like we humans, we never talk over each other.
Exactly, especially in Zoom, right? We're all too familiar over the last 2 years. But no, that's a great question. So that is actually a problem. So even in a problem for those of us who are trying to study their calls, but maybe not a problem for the whales themselves. But for example, in this study, the challenge I had was to find calls that weren't occurring with background song. And because song occurs a lot. So often there was background song, but if it was loud enough that it was showing up on the spectrogram, then I logged those calls, but I couldn't use it for the statistical analysis. And before I did this project, I worked with the North Atlantic humpback whale acoustic data during their feeding ground, and they just had calls happening all the time and were talking over each other. I found that more common there. So that can be a bit of a challenge.
Mei Ling wants to know, when a calf is born, do they automatically know how to swim?
Yeah, they do. It's really crazy to think they're, as soon as they emerge, they're able to swim. But in the field, I have seen that the mother does sometimes have to help them with, reaching the surface for breathing, or the calf will kind of rest on her because they're still pretty tiny and don't have as much strength as their mother. So, yeah.
Another one of mine, I'm slipping my own ones in here once in a while. Since there's you noted that there was no really low frequency in the mother calf pairs. I thought that was pretty interesting. Do you think that might be because they are maintaining such a close proximity to each other, and you might not really need to have that low long distance?
Seriously, these are such good acoustic questions. Yeah, actually, because lower frequency calls are thought to have a longer range for potentially like long range communication compared to high frequency. So yeah, if they're hanging out, in close proximity as they do, then maybe they don't have a need for lower frequency calls. And that was also found with dyad pairs, which are two humpback whales. They had higher frequency calls, and that might be because it's potentially for short range communication.
Leanne wants to know that she says that there have been studies that indicate orca copy other whale species calls. Do you know if humpbacks mimic other whale sounds?
Oh yeah. So I cannot confirm if there's a study on this, but that doesn't mean there aren't. But I have heard this talking to other people who do acoustics. So for my PhD, I'm going to be looking at whale calls in the Arctic, and I was being introduced to the data set, and the researcher was like telling me how tricky it is to determine between bowhead whale calls and humpback whale calls, because they think that humpback whales will mimic other species. And I've also heard that about humpback whales and right whales, like in the North Atlantic. So I don't know if there are any peer-reviewed studies. There might be, but I know I've heard that they are known to mimic other whale calls, which is
I see a future invitation for you to come back after you spent some time up there parsing that out for us. And a year or two from now, we'll be able to have you back with at least your read on that. Thank you. Do you think that they're not making a lot of noise when they're traveling because they are kind of running silent? They're trying to hide?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know what they would be hiding from in the Hawaiian breeding ground, because we don't, I mean, transient orcas are very rarely known to be around, but not commonly in Hawaii. I could see that like in other habitats where there is a lot of crossover with orcas, for example. But in the Hawaiian breeding ground, the main issue would be tiger sharks and calves. So I'm not totally sure why other pods that are traveling that don't necessarily have a calf would be quiet. I mean, my guess is that the calls have a more like social function, and maybe there's not a lot of talking while traveling. I'm not sure.
Has anybody ever actually dropped a hydrophone in the water and played humpback whale sounds to try to bring tiger sharks in? Do we know whether tiger sharks actually respond in a positive way, like, let me go have a little lunch over here someplace?
No one's ever done that, but since humpback whale song is occurring so and so often and continuously in the water column, I would be surprised if tiger sharks or other animals really even like, they're probably used to it. I'm sure like when winter rolls around, they're like, oh, those noisy whales are gonna come in here.
The noisy neighbors are back.
This
Uh,
spring
Carla,
break party
yeah.
kids.
We got a couple more, and then I know you got a time certain. So Carla is asking, is there any way to find out if the whales are sending each other sonar pictures through their calls?
I wish. I have no idea about that.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear more about, to be honest, I don't know as much about like echolocation sonar. Does any dolphin people here that can, I know that, Adonisites and dolphins can have kind of mental pictures of objects and stuff, but I don't know about sending each other images. I don't think we've been able to look at that or really prove that.
Well, awesome. And then my last question, or maybe my last question, I never know. I always come up with more, but on the sound spectrum that you're able to measure with your hydrophones, and you played sounds that we could hear, are the whales making sounds that we can't hear, that you've been able to measure acoustically, and you can show that they're there, but the human ear just isn't able to pick it up?
Well, that definitely happens with other species like blue whale calls. A lot of them tend to be in lower frequencies that we can't pick up, so we have to like speed them up. So I haven't seen that with humpback whales, but it doesn't mean it's not possible.
Okay. All right. Well, I read all the questions to you that I see in the chat room, and I certainly peppered you with a bunch of my own personal ones, Sabena, and I really thank you very, very much. If there are any other questions, does anybody want to ask at this point? And we have this wonderful speaker. If not, I'll turn it back to Leanne, because I know that Sabena is a student and she has student responsibilities. So Leanne, back to you.
Okay. Thank you so much. You were talking about the whoop call, and I think it's obviously not just a whale call. It's a human sporting event call, and or maybe you play the whoop, there it is, over the hydrophones to the whales. Anyway, I thought it was very fascinating. I loved a lot of the facts and details that you put out there. Thank you so much, and good luck to you in your studies, and just obviously have fun.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. And I guess we'll see everybody next month on March 9th, and I hope you have a great couple weeks. And get out there and see those whales in San Diego if you can. Have a good night.
And we do record these, and the recording will be up on our website, probably be by the end of the week.
Bye. Have fun, Rick.
All right, well, you'll know.
Yeah, yeah.
All right,
I'll
take
be
care.
watching for the videos,
Yeah,
the
take care.
Instagram posts. All right, bye.